It's February 19th, 1777, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.
It was today in history in 1777 that the US Continental Congress voted to promote 5 officers, Benjamin Lincoln, Thomas Mifflin, Arthur St. Clair, William Alexander and Adam Stephen, to the rank of Major General. The promotions themselves are an extremely minor footnote in the American War of Independence. The real historical significance of this episode lies in who they did not promote.
Yeah, the man that they didn't promote was Benedict Arnold, and he was senior in rank to all 5 men that they did promote that day, and he had an amazing track record as a very successful military leader.
Surely not going to relitigate this now, Ariel. It's been 250 years.
This is all to say that the promotions were, they were partly political and partly regional. Congress was trying to find a balance of generals from different states to promote. But from Arnold's perspective, this was a stunning snub because he was the senior brigadier and he was expecting promotion by both his merit and his seniority, only to learn that all of these junior officers had leapfrogged him. He was incensed, he was humiliated, and his own personal correspondence from the period shows that he was threatening to resign from the Continental Army in protest, basically feeling that Congress's actions were implicitly declaring him unworthy of higher command.
Yeah, if, by the way, you're a Brit, you may not have heard of Brigadier General Benedict Arnold, so you may not understand the significance of him being snubbed on this day. So let's just spell it out. And if you're American, I apologise because I realise you're all taught this at school, and he's like a byword for treachery. But essentially, why Benedict Arnold is important in the American Revolution is he was a turncoat. Not only did he defect to the British in the most shocking way, having fought for the Americans, but actually he was right to be aggrieved on this day because he had fought valiantly for the Americans. He was an incredible patriot and one of the standout soldiers of the American Revolution. So that's sort of why this is important. But I mean, I don't know, you tell me, Rebecca, because there are lots of sort of sliding doors moments in Arnold's career, aren't there? People often say, just to fast forward a bit, that if he had have died at the battles of Saratoga, then he would be considered one of America's greatest heroes. That was the sliding doors moment. Other people say it was the moment, obviously, that he chose to defect to the British. Why is this a really important moment in that story?
This wasn't just a career disappointment. It was an affront so severe that most officers of the time would have seen no option but to resign. Promotion was based on seniority, and so if you were denied your turn, that was an incredibly public snub. And when George Washington wrote to Benedict Arnold after he was passed over, you can tell he's very aware of this. He urges him not to take any hasty steps. He even suggests that the omission must have been a mistake. But what actually happened, as you were alluding to earlier, was that Congress simply wanted an even number of generals from the different states, and Arnold was from Connecticut and they already had the number that they wanted from Connecticut. So that's all it was. But they didn't understand that military culture and that feeling that was then engendered in Arnold that he had been humiliated in front of, as far as he perceived it, everybody. And when you read his correspondence with Washington, one thing he mentions in particular is that it was printed in the papers. You can see George Washington going into manager mode, and he writes this letter that's very clearly designed to smooth Arnold's feathers, saying how shocked he was to see that he had been omitted from the list, explaining that he'd gone to all this trouble making inquiries and found out that it was just a political quota decision, thanking him for not resigning. He writes at the end, all the satisfaction that an individual can obtain when he is overlooked is, if innocent, a consciousness that he has not deserved such treatment for his honest exertions. But as we were going to see, this was not enough to mollify Arnold.
Yeah, it was fortunately just enough to get him back into action, though. In April 1777, he marched to confront the British forces who were advancing on Danbury in Connecticut, and he later fought a battle at Ridgefield where he was again wounded. For all this, Congress did eventually promote him to Major General on the 2nd of May 1777, but he still felt slighted. And later that year, he did continue to fight as a soldier, but eventually after the British left Philadelphia in June 1778, Washington managed to appoint Arnold as the city's military commander, which took him off the front lines. But later historians judged this as another step on his path towards becoming a turncoat and defecting to the British Army, kind of because once he was in Philadelphia, some of his natural tendencies towards not being the most honourable gentleman came to the fore.
Yeah, okay, we'll get into that in a minute. Like, basically, was he a bit of a dick, right? But I'm just interested in this business about, like, what's going on in his head. Because it's not that much of a shock that he joins the British if you remember that he's from New England. And everyone in New England saw themselves as New Englanders first before they were Americans. That's what the Revolutionary War was, right? It hadn't happened yet. You know, they didn't have a country with states in it. They were New Englanders, and they had some loyalty to the fact that, you know, that their entire community had been founded by Brits who had come over to create New England and the Puritanical Church and all of that. I don't think he hates British people. I don't think he doesn't see himself as someone who's from English stock. The point is, he believes in the Constitution of America, and he believes in the dream that Washington's working towards and the Founding Fathers. He believes that, you know, there's a USA that's worth fighting for at the end of this, and these guys who are turning up in places like Ridgefield need to be fought, and you need to win against them, even if you're going to get shot at and your horse is going to get shot at from underneath you, and there's not enough of you to take on the British because they've got the powerful army. They're in the wrong coming here and fighting us when we're trying to sort ourselves out politically. And I think he believed both those things at once. And so what tips him is this feeling of being ostracized. And you can trace that all the way back to his very earliest history, where his dad's an alcoholic and his family's sort of ostracized. And you can sort of psychologically just see his whole career as like an attempt to regain honor and reputation for his family.
Yeah, his family were very prominent initially. His great-grandfather was one of the first settlers in Rhode Island. He'd been a governor of the colony, and the family had got very wealthy as merchants. But his father's alcoholism meant that they lost that business. Arnold was in private school at the time. He had to be pulled out. There was no money for him to go to Yale, which had always been the plan that had been, you know, told to him since he was a child. He ended up then being sent away as an apprentice to his mother's cousins who were merchants, where he proved to be really talented. One thing about Arnold is that he was really quite good at everything that he turned his hand to. He became independently wealthy once he struck out on his own, and this sort of ignited his political interest. American merchants were the ones who were being hit by all these new duties that the British were placing on goods arriving in America. And after the Boston Massacre, which obviously generated a lot of outrage, he joined one of the new militia companies springing up. He was elected as its captain, but he was a great strategist as well. Even though his only military experience before this was a very brief spell in the militia as a teenager, after 2 months he was appointed colonel, and he was so confident that he personally went and sought out George Washington to pitch him an idea he had for an alternative attack on Quebec City. They were attacking Quebec City at the time, which impressed Washington enough that he made Arnold a colonel in the Continental Army and let him lead the operation, which was a success, and that won him the promotion to brigadier general, which of course was when it started to get, you know, a little bit sticky. And I have to say, just to come back to the fact that what happened on this day, him being passed over, within a few months, as we mentioned earlier, that was actually rectified. Congress did then promote him to Major General, which is what he wanted, but then he was stewing over the fact that his seniority hadn't also been restored, which meant that he was now behind those 5 officers who'd been promoted ahead of him in the list, and that was upsetting him too. And then after the Battle of Saratoga, where he was seriously wounded and distinguished himself, Congress actually offered to restore his seniority as well, but he just could not chill for the reasons that we've outlined. He thought it was a sympathy gesture because he'd been wounded. He wanted them to admit that they had been wrong in the first place, which they weren't interested in doing. At this point, he just could not be pacified.
And another thing that came to contribute was the fact that once he was in Philadelphia, he quickly met and married Peggy Shippen. She was the daughter of a young loyalist family with strong British connections. And Peggy had previously been courted by a Brit called Major John Andre. Note, by the way, that at this stage, Arnold is in his mid to late 40s, and Peggy is an 18-year-old. So there's a big age difference between them. Peggy continued to keep contact with Major John Andre. Obviously, she really loved. But through that line of communication, Arnold started communicating with the Brits as well. And that's where he came up with this notion that maybe the idea of becoming a double agent, at least if not defecting altogether, could be quite lucrative. He
was feeding information about troop movements to his British handlers, and it all fell apart when Andre was captured by American militiamen in September 1780, and he was carrying papers from Arnold in which they were discussing plans to help the fort of West Point that Arnold was commanding. fall into British hands. So the writing was very much on the wall. Washington was actually meant to be having breakfast with Arnold that morning, but he didn't turn up. He had actually fled. When Washington was brought the evidence of his betrayal, he reportedly said, "Arnold has betrayed me. Whom can we trust now?"
Immediately after he defected, he was given British commands. He then successfully became a brigadier general in the British Army, and he led raids against American targets, but he was obviously a persona non grata in the US, but also people in the UK knew what he had done and what he was capable of, and he actually died in 1801 without military honours. So it sort of stands as this ongoing cautionary tale about how, wounded pride and unchecked ambition can lead a gifted patriot to be giftedly patriotic for two sides, and neither of them terribly happily in the end.
Yeah, and also it's interesting that he was kind of celebrated in the British press when he was valiantly fighting the British, but the moment that he defected to the British, they just didn't care about him. He wasn't a household name in England, and they forgot about him, and he died, in the UK, and no one in London wrote anything about it, whereas back in the US, his letter, his open letter, was published throughout the colonies, explaining why he felt that he had been betrayed, and that's why he'd betrayed America, and there was an enormous amount of interest in him, and he became this figure that they had to destroy statues of and stuff like this. But to return to my question then, Rebecca, yes, he was overlooked numerous times, including on this day, but was it because he was a bit of a dick?
In a one-word answer, yes. He was incredibly thin-skinned, even by the standards of the time. I think I've tried to contextualize him in the standards of the time and the military culture of the time, but even by those standards, he was a prickly pear, and actually that continued for his post-military career as well. As you mentioned, he wasn't very well liked in London as well as in the US. So he ended up in New Brunswick in Canada, where he engaged in some land speculation. Safe to say he wasn't very popular there either. On one occasion, townspeople burned an effigy of him outside his house.
Oh, that's never good, is it?
It's never a good sign.
And do you reckon he was like, oh, but the guy next door had a much bigger effigy than me?
Tomorrow.
Fill up a glass of dirty water and pretend that you're going to have eternal life.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/Retrospectors.